So the book that I was reading when this woman approached me and we had this conversation was Elie Wiesel's Night. And it is, for those unfamiliar with it, his autobiographical tale of having gone from being I think he's 15-year-old living Jewish boy living with his family in Czechoslovakia, and then being dragged into Auschwitz and losing most of his family. But before, while their world still looked somewhat intact, just a little excerpt from this. Spring 1944. Splendid news from the Russian front. There could no longer be any doubt. Germany would be defeated. It was only a matter of time, months or weeks perhaps. The trees were in bloom. It was a year like so many others, with its spring, its engagements, its weddings, and its births. The people were saying, the Red Army is advancing with giant strides. Hitler will not be able to harm us, even if he wants to. Yes, we even doubted his resolve to exterminate us. Annihilate an entire people? Wipe out a population dispersed throughout so many nations? So many millions of people. By what means? In the middle of the 20th century. And thus my elders concerned themselves with all manner of things. Strategy, diplomacy, politics, and Zionism, but not with their own fate. Even Moishe the beetle had fallen silent. He was weary of talking. He would drift through synagogue or through the streets, hunched over, eyes cast down, avoiding people's gaze. He was someone who had seen some of the truth of what the Nazis were up to and could not convince his fellow villagers. In those days, it was still possible to buy emigration certificates to Palestine. I had asked my father to sell everything, to liquidate everything, and to leave. I am too old, my son, he answered. Too old to start a new life. Too old to start from scratch in some distant land. Budapest radio announced that the fascist party had seized power. The regent Miklos Horthy was forced to ask a leader of the pro-Nazi Nihilist party to form a new government. Yet we were still not worried. Of course we had heard of the fascists, but it was all in the abstract. It meant nothing more to us than a change of ministry. The next day brought really disquieting news. German troops had penetrated Hungarian territory with the government's approval. Finally, people began to worry in earnest. One of my friends, Moishe Chaim Berkowitz, returned from the capital for Passover and told us the Jews of Budapest live in an atmosphere of fear and terror. Anti-Semitic acts take place every day in the streets, on the trains. The fascists attack Jewish stores, synagogues. The situation is becoming very serious. The news spread through Sikhet like wildfire. Soon that was all people talked about. But not for long. Optimism soon revived. The Germans will not come this far. They will stay in Budapest. For strategic reasons, for political reasons. In less than 3 days, German army vehicles made their appearance on our streets. One more paragraph. Anguish. German soldiers with their steel helmets and their death's head emblem. Still, our first impressions of the Germans were rather reassuring. The officers were billeted in private homes, even in Jewish homes. Their attitude towards their hosts was distant but polite. They never demanded the impossible, made no offensive remarks, and sometimes even smiled at the lady of the house. A German officer lodged in the Khan's house across the street from us. We were told he was a charming man, calm, likable, and polite. 3 days after he moved in, he bought Mrs. Khan a box of chocolates. The optimists were jubilant. Well, what did we tell you? You wouldn't believe us. There they are, you're Germans. What do you say now? Where is their famous cruelty? The Germans were already in our town. The fascists were already in power. The verdict was already out. And the Jews of Sikhet were still smiling. We never see it when it happens.
Yeah, I have to say that's makes me very angry to hear. Actually,
Tell what is that?
Well,
I had not shared that with you before.
I think there's something about it because there are these photographs that emerged some years ago, lost photographs of Nazis, men and women outside of, I think, Auschwitz, enjoying blueberries or something, right? Mm-hmm. There's something about the recognition of how much they understood and yet were willing to behave as they did. That is, it's more chilling it places the crime in an even more chilling context. And hearing about, what is obviously the immediately before times is very frightening. Now, of course,
So the people themselves, the targets, the people who will largely be annihilated. The man writing this book, Elie Wiesel, obviously survived, but most of his family did not, could not convince themselves that what they were seeing, the intimations they were getting, what they were hearing was real.
I think the problem, and we keep encountering this in different places. Eric years ago pointed me to this Kostler piece, The Screamer, which makes this point about the difficulty of seeing these things as they actually occurred rather than as history writes them. I mean, the idea that, World War II was fought without the full awareness of the population about what they were in fact fighting about. They knew who they were fighting, but
certainly the American men who were fighting in the European theater had no idea.
Well, there's a question about who had no idea, and the point of the Screamers is that many people had every reason to know and somehow managed to convince themselves that it wasn't happening.
Right.
But there is also the fact that we tend to synonymize the Holocaust and World War II, and in fact, the Holocaust was revealed by the success in the war. What had taken place is revealed later. Yeah. And of course, for all of those of us too young to have been alive at that point, it sort of all gets written as the history of the moment rather than the history of the revelation.
Right. That's critical. Actually, there's we need a history that takes into account theory of mind. Like the people who you're reading about who lived concurrently with things, but they didn't know, or they could have known, but they didn't know. They had a cognitive dissonance, or they really didn't know, and yet they were still willing to fight. Like all of these things were realities for people, and having it be in history means that it's very hard for most of us to do the additional level of theory of mind of okay,
sorry,
God doesn't play dice, but maybe you do. Is that what's going on here?
Yes.
Okay. It's very hard for us to know, to recognize what people's lives were actually like, which is part of why these first-person accounts from someone as extraordinary as Elie Wiesel are so critical to be reflecting. And of course, he's reflecting after he has survived, and most of his family hasn't. So he's writing in retrospect, but to be remembering that there were indications, and that it was still so desirable to enjoy spring. Right, to enjoy the peaches and the engagements, and peaches are summer, but to be human with one another, even as there may be people who are actively working to take that humanity away.
Well, there's definitely an aspect of it's later than you think, and that's the problem. Is that to have an accurate reaction before the Germans descend in that piece. In that segment that you read, before they descended was the right time to react, to prepare, to flee, or to figure out how to fight. And what the excerpt you read reports is essentially a rationalization process about why it won't be all that bad. And then there's a reassuring, here's all the evidence that it isn't that bad. And the point is, of course, it was exactly that bad and far worse. But the question really, the obvious question is how to extrapolate from this, right? It could always be later than you think. And then the point is you should always be in a state of preparing for it being exactly that bad and far worse, which of course wouldn't make any sense because it isn't always that bad. But the question is, where are you in history?